Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews, and part 3 of my 1/76 scale LVT-4 Amtrac build from the Airfix Buffalo. In this video, I'm going to be completing the kit with some weathering, experimenting with some new rust techniques, as well as trying to create a wet and slightly sandy look to this model. So without further ado, let's finish this one off. With the decal sealed and the varnish fully cured, I could now move on to the weathering. In keeping with experimenting, I decided to try a chipping technique I've seen both Night Shift and Plasmo use for their armoured vehicles, which first involves adding a light layer of chips. These are usually a lighter colour than the camouflage, which in this case would be some Vallejo model colour flat white, mixed with model colour US olive drab. I then dry brushed this paint onto the edges and sharp corners of the hull, very heavily on the hull roof, floor and ramp where there would be a lot of foot traffic and exposure to the harsh Pacific sun, and also some random scratches along the side of the hull. I really liked how this technique looked, especially on the upper hull in terms of creating a faded paint effect, and it was reasonably easy to do. My advice would be to make sure you're careful and apply the paint sparingly, and also make sure that you wipe off most of the wet paint from your brush onto some paper towel, so that when you dab it onto the model, it doesn't produce any soft edges or too much of a buildup. While the lighter coloured chips dried, I added some paint chips to all of the white markings by dabbing on some US olive drab. The next stage for this chipping technique would be to then go over these lighter chips with some Vallejo model colour Old Rust. This darker colour has a very nice rusty chipped paint sort of look to it, and when applied carefully, the lighter base colour makes it pop and gives an illusion of depth to the chipping. It's a bit tricky to see on the model using the camera, but in real life when you see it, it really pops. For this, I found that making sure that the paint was dry when dabbing it onto the model, and applying it sparingly so that each rust chip was still surrounded by some of the lighter paint made the effect a lot better. I was really happy with the more rusty look to the chips on this model, but for some fresher metal chipping, I decided to also apply some Vallejo Model Air aluminium. I kept the chipping limited to just parts of the front mudguard and ramp, as well as in the hull walkway. This colour was also used to paint the rear convoy lights, and to dry brush the track cleats. Once the acrylic paints had dried, which didn't take too long, I then got out some Tamiya Black Panel Ascent, Tamiya X20 enamel thinners, and some AK Interactive Light Rust and Dark Rust for some enamel weathering. I first used the Black Panel Ascent by running it over the machine guns, recessed details on the driver's cab, and onto the hull roof to highlight the recessed details and add some depth. The excess panel wash would then be gently removed with a cotton bud which had been dipped in enamel thinners. This dried pretty quickly, so I then moved on to adding some rust streak and effects to give the impression that this LVT had been used heavily and exposed to the sea, air and water in the Pacific. For this, I first used a brush and dabbed on some of the AK Dark Rust deposits. I applied it sparingly over some of the chipped areas, and then used a fine brush dipped in enamel thinners to streak it downwards and soften the effect. I repeated this process a few times around the entire vehicle, also applying it at the base of all of the grab handles, along the ramp and the floor. This colour was quite dark and uniform, so I added some streaking with the much lighter AK Interactive Light Rust wash. If I applied it too heavily in any areas, I then removed the excess with enamel thinners, which was also used to once again blend and streak these colours. I continued adding a few streaks and marks with both the Dark Rust and Light Rust on the hull, and then I mixed up some of the Dark Rust with enamel thinners to produce a rust wash, which I then applied onto the tracks to add a build-up in their hinges. Once this was done, I gave the model a day or two for the enamel effects to fully dry. For this build, I decided to try modelling my LVT as though it had just exited the water and was driving onto a sandy beach to drop off a load of Marines, so for reference I used scenes from HBO's fantastic series The Pacific. Even if the weathering on the LVTs in this series may have been done artificially, it still looks very convincing, and the way that the sand and water interacted with these vehicles was real. So based on that, I used some fine sawdust and AK gravel and sand fixer to apply a build-up of fine texture in between the tracks and the top of the sponsons where it seems to build up. This effect can also be seen in photos and seems to have been particularly common with the British buffaloes, although of course that would have been mud given they were in the European theatre. I built up a few layers of the sawdust, dusting off the excess, and then I left it to dry for about a day. Obviously the sawdust was way too dark to be sand, so I had to then paint it with some Vallejo model colour Iraqi sand. I also streaked this colour down the sides and thinned it heavily with water to add some fine particles of sand falling down the sides of the hull. I don't usually use acrylic paints for weathering, but I found it pretty easy to use the water to thin down the edges and also add a bit of feathering, and once the acrylic paints had dried, it produced a really nice subtle washed out and sandy effect. As I painted and weathered the model, I found that some of the fragile grab handles fell off, but fortunately I made a couple of spares with the 3D printer, so it was super easy to just glue replacements on and paint them up later. The sawdust required a second coat of Iraqi sand to make it a little bit lighter and more solid, and I also used it to add some dry brush scratches and chips onto the wooden benches inside of the hull, and to add a light buildup of sand on the floor. Unfortunately, despite multiple attempts at repairs, the ramp continuously fell apart, as the fine hoops that were supposed to lock them into place were very fragile and poorly moulded. I attempted gluing them back together a few times, and also replacing them with a spare handle, but nothing really worked that was solid, so I may have to at some point replace them with some finer wire or something else so that I can still open and close the ramp like I wish for some animations. After all of the replaced handles had been painted a few coats of olive drab, I then sealed in all of the enamel washes, the chipping and the sand effects with a very thin coat of Vallejo Model Air semi-gloss varnish. I allowed the varnish to cure for 24 hours before then trying out some AK Interactive wet effects for the first time. This enamel product was applied using a large pointy brush, and I did it in various patterns such as streaking down the sides of the hull, as well as dabbing it onto the edges of panel lines where water would sit and slowly dry from, in a flicking and stippling pattern on the sides of the hull for some splash effects, and I also built up several layers heavily on top of the sponsons, on the underside of the hull, the tracks, and the floor of the troop carrying compartment. For a first attempt, I was pretty happy with the effect that this created, although I'm sure there are probably better ways to apply it a little bit more realistically. Once it was applied, I then gave it a few hours to fully dry before I finally painted the 3D printed convoy lights with some Tamiya X27 clear red. And with that, I decided to call my Airfix LVT-4 Amtrac conversion finally completed. And here you can see the final result. So it's been quite a while since I last did an armoured kit, and despite the Airfix kit showing its age and the quality being a bit lacking in some areas, especially for the ramp's attachment points, I still had quite a lot of fun building this one. Upgrading this kit with the extra vision ports, handles, rear lights and details, the American machine guns, and replacing the tracks made a big difference, and I'm very happy with how these details improved the kit. Of course, it also comes with a Willys Jeep, but frankly it looked a little bit meh to me with the wheels and general details, so I'm not too sure what I'm going to end up doing with that one just yet. I think overall I did alright with weathering and painting this model. It was all a bit of an experiment to try different approaches to chipping using the old rust and lighter camo colour instead of just aluminium, and I quite liked how that turned out. I rarely weather my tanks with much more than some basic dirt and mud in the tracks, so trying for a specific appearance with the rust, sand and water was a bit of a challenge, but I quite enjoyed doing it. Of course though, it being the first time I've tried this, I would definitely love to hear other people's thoughts on how they'd go about adding some of these effects. Even though this is a basic and old kit, and the fact that it's in 1/76 scale instead of the now much more standard 1/72 scale, there doesn't appear to be too many better alternatives for LVTs in this range, apart from a kit by Dragon, which apparently is for a post-World War II vehicle and has its own issues from what I've heard. So if you want an LVT, this does seem to be one of the only real options, at least for now. My upgrades are available for purchase on my Colts page, so if you have one of these kits and want to upgrade and convert it from the British Buffalo, you can also do so. At some point though in the future, I will be designing my own full 1/72nd scale kit for this vehicle, along with some Marines to crew it, and maybe also some of those wacky fire support vehicles they made using its chassis. But it may be quite some time before I get around to doing that. So while it's not a great kit by modern standards, it's still not a bad one to put together, and I'm sure for many people it holds a lot of nostalgia. It can also still be upgraded with scratch building or 3D printing, and although I'm probably not going to build this one again, I am looking forward to using this kit I've made in a stop motion at some point in the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel, as it really helps out. And if you also want to help me fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I spend making these videos, then please consider checking out and joining my Patreon. A massive thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help make these videos possible, and if you have any advice you want to share on how I could have improved this build or how other model makers could do so as well, then feel free to leave it down in the comments below. The next build series that will be coming out will be on the Airfix 1/72nd scale Bristol Beaufighter, so I'm looking forward to sharing the first part of that sometime next week. Otherwise though, thanks again for watching, and until the next one, as always, take care and model on.